In the last video, we talked about the low-ranking soldiers, the low-ranking combatants who do most of the fighting in war. And we saw a couple of those names from the play Henry V, Bardolph and Nym. Now, unfortunately for Bardolph, he's going to do in the play what a lot of combatants will do, and that is go trophy hunting. Although in Bardolph's case, this might be a little bit different because he's accused of robbing a church. So it may be that he's not out to get trophies. It may be that he's out to pillage, and that's kind of what it seems like. Bardolph is going to pay for this with his life. And this is poignant and difficult for Henry V because Bardolph had been a friend of Henry V when Henry was younger, before he became king. But Bardolph engages in pillage and has to pay with his life. Let's just pause and say that, of course, pillage is something that happens a lot in war. And trophy hunting, which is a different thing, also happens in war, quite understandably. Combatants want to bring home remembrances, relics from their time at war. But it looks like with the case of Bardolph here, we're looking at straight pillage. And he doesn't just pillage, but he pillages from a church, which I think in the early modern period, that's going to be especially frowned on. Now, what's interesting here is that Henry V comes down very hard on Bardolph, and we'll look at his quote in a minute. But it wasn't so much, it wasn't, many pages before in the play where Henry V is himself threatening the civilian population, or threatening a civilian population at Harfleur, that if the governor of that town did not surrender, then Harfleur would be razed, that the civilians would be attacked. And so Henry V had it in him, I think, to not only to pillage, but to go well beyond that and to wreak devastation on civilian populations. That was the threat, anyway, that he made to the governor of Harfleur. But the governor of Harfleur did surrender. Harfleur falls into the hands of the forces of Henry V. And now it seems that Henry V's disposition is to abide by what we would call these days the rules of war. And so he says we would have all such offenders so cut off. So any soldiers who pillage, any soldiers who mistreat civilians, they should be cut off. I think we can translate that as executed. And we give express charge that in our marches through the country, there be nothing compelled from the villages. Don't steal from the villagers. Don't take food. Don't take money. Don't take other seemingly interesting items from the villages. Nothing taken but paid for. If you have to take something, pay for it. None of the French upbraided. Don't mistreat the French people. Don't abuse them in disdainful language. So Henry V's disposition here seems to be to treat the civilian population as well as they can be treated given the context, and to come down really hard on soldiers who mistreat civilians living in this world of war. As I read those lines from Henry V, I'm reminded of a general order that Robert E. Lee put out when his Army of Northern Virginia, when these Confederate forces in the American Civil War invaded the North. The American Civil War is fought overwhelmingly on Southern soil. But one of the major battles of the war was fought in Southern Pennsylvania, in the North at Gettysburg. And as Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces are making their way north, they do then cross into enemy territory in the North, outside of the Confederacy. And I'm almost certain, I don't have proof right here, but I'm pretty confident Robert E. Lee knew this play by Shakespeare. He puts out a general order where he, just focusing on the bits in the white here, he expresses satisfaction with the conduct of his troops as they have moved into the land of the enemy. But of course they're among civilians, non-combatants, as they're marching into the north, and that he's been generally satisfied with the conduct of the troops on the ground, although he does say there have been some instances of forgetfulness. Some soldiers apparently have perhaps taken a chicken or taken a cow or a pig or some other item, or perhaps civilians in the north have been treated disrespectfully. Lee refers to the duties exacted of us by civilization and Christianity. This interesting idea that even in the context of war, rules apply, that as savage as battle can be, that there are still rules at work. There are still rules that keep the world of war from becoming, from descending into total savagery. So he refers to duties exacted of us by civilization and Christianity, which are not less obligatory in the country of the enemy than in our own. Now Lee goes on to say that, northern forces in the south, he refers to barbarous outrages that have been committed by northern forces in the south. And it is true that in the Civil War we see civilian property destroyed. We see cities destroyed. We see farms destroyed. We see railroads destroyed. Things that, railroads certainly can be linked to the Confederate war effort, but other things that would, farms that are there to provide food, yes, for soldiers, but also for civilians. Many farms will also be destroyed. And Lee says, look, we're not going to copy what our enemy in the South is doing, right? As we move into the North, we need to live up to the high ideals of the civilization that we're part of. Down below, the commanding general therefore earnestly exhorts the troops to abstain with most scrupulous care from unnecessary or wanton injury to private property. And he enjoins upon officers to arrest and bring to summary punishment all who shall in any way offend against the orders on this subject. So I don't know if a Confederate soldier went into a church and stole something from a church. I don't know exactly what punishment might be meted out to that soldier, but Lee is sending a clear message. And the message is quite similar to the one that Henry V makes in the play. There are counterexamples, and when I think of sort of a counterexample, if Robert E. Lee, like Henry V in that portion of the play, if they emphasize the importance of treating civilians well, we are not at war with 11-year-old boys. We are not at war with women who are not combatants. We are not at war with older men who are not combatants. We're not at war with the injured who are not able to fight. And we should treat these people with as much decency as we can. If I think of a counterexample, the strongest counterexample that comes to my mind is the case of Soviet soldiers. We could think of Russia as the core country of the Soviet Union. Soviet soldiers as they move into Germany. Now, of course, as the Germans in the Second World War move east into Russia, into Soviet territory, deep into Soviet territory, they commit atrocities of their own. There's no question about that. The Nazi regime was a murderous regime. We think particularly of Jews, but also Catholic priests, teachers. Others will be pulled from the civilian population and treated very, very harshly, executed, etc. And so the Nazis committed plenty of their own atrocities. As the Soviets come back, as the Soviets in the latter part of the war then push the Germans westward, and as the Soviets then move into Germany proper, it's payback time, but in a different way, although in a still horrendous way. And I think especially this diary called A Woman in Berlin, published anonymously, comes to mind, where a German woman records sort of what happens when the Soviets arrive in Berlin, and of course it happens in other places besides Berlin as well, where effectively as a matter of policy, when Soviet forces move into German cities, when Soviet forces move into Berlin, almost as a matter of policy. It's open season on the German women. I think in both cases, we might be able to understand psychologically why the Soviets would exact this kind of revenge, although I think most of us would agree in both cases. We want to denounce the sort of atrocities that took place. You see that photo below there, which gives us just a sense of what things were like. So this is a great counterexample, and it's an interesting question as to cultural differences, historical differences, contextual differences that lead to different responses when you have forces from one country or from one place in the territory of the enemy and yet among civilians. How are those civilians treated? Well, then we have some pretty notable differences. This comes to me from a Vietnam veteran, and I've heard this many times from Vietnam veterans who served with South Korean forces in the war. Now, Vietnam veterans from the United States often complain about the rules of engagement. They often say that they feel as they were operating in South Vietnam, fighting communist forces, fighting nationalist forces in South Vietnam, they often feel as if their hands were tied. Not so with the South Koreans. The South Korean allies of the United States, the word that's most used by Vietnamese veterans, veterans of the United States who fought in Vietnam, the word that's most used when they speak of our South Korean allies there is tough. And that word tough covers a lot of ground. And tough meaning persevering in battle, but tough also meaning very, very severe. Not only when it comes to the treatment of the enemy, but to civilians in that world of war. This excerpt from a document I received from a Vietnam veteran, I understand I realize it's very small for you to see there, but this has to do with the treatment of South Korean forces, with their treatment of captured Vietnamese enemies. It says, on a trip to take wounded prisoners out for the South Koreans, I noticed a row of prisoners. So these would be perhaps North Vietnamese prisoners, perhaps what are called Viet Cong prisoners, so the enemy of the United States, the South Koreans, the South Vietnamese allies, etc. So we noticed a row of prisoners. Some of them with wounds, they had been left behind lying on the ground. When we were called back in later, some of these were dead, shot to death. The other pilot with me asked the Koreans what happened, and we were told they get dead very fast. What really happened was the prisoners had been shot during interrogation. Now this is combatant to combatant, although in this case these enemy combatants were no longer apparently a threat. They were prisoners, some of them were wounded. And here we have then allies who operate according to very, very different rules of engagement, very, very different rules of war. American forces, this sort of thing would be very rare. I've heard many stories of American medics spending time and energy and even risking their own lives to tend to enemy wounded, right? To get not only friendly wounded out of a place, but to get enemy wounded out of a place. And there are rules of war at work here. When your enemy is wounded and not a threat to you, then the care of that enemy becomes your responsibility. And I think that for the most part that is observed among American forces. I feel confident among Australian forces as well. South Korean forces in Vietnam operated according to different rules. In this case, we have the apparent execution of Vietnamese enemies. But to link it to the theme of the video, that same veteran, who gave this document to me, said that the South Koreans would not have a lot of problems among Vietnamese villages because what they would say is, for example, this veteran told me, they would go to a village close by and they would say, if we get one shot at us, if we have one sniper bullet shot at us from this village, we're going to destroy this entire village, right? And I think, I mean, implicit in that is a threat, and we're going to kill everybody in this village, right? And tough is the word that's used. And this veteran said that the South Korean forces never received a single sniper bullet from that village. The point being that in this case, the United States has an ally, a very tough ally, that when it's among civilians, does not operate according to the same rules of engagement. Now, we have the case of more recent conflicts in the United States, Iraq and Afghanistan. Like Vietnam, these wars are very difficult for American forces because the enemy, most of the enemy anyway, don't wear uniforms. In the case of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese soldiers will wear uniforms, but the Viet Cong will not. Early in the war in Iraq in 2003, the United States is facing the Iraqi army. But before long, those soldiers take their uniforms off. And then the United States is now in a war against insurgents. And we can't tell who's friend or foe. The foe does not wear a uniform. In Afghanistan, fighting Al-Qaeda forces, fighting Taliban forces. These forces don't wear uniforms. They look like any other Afghan males in the country. And so it's often impossible to know just by looking who's friend or foe. But these rules of engagement are in place. And one of the reasons the rules of engagement are in place is because we want to minimize the amount of damage done to civilians, partly for reasons of humanity, right? But partly because another reason, a practical reason being that if civilians are harmed, if people who are not directly involved in war, if the innocent civilians are harmed, then that just makes our work harder, because if innocent civilians are harmed, then that turns innocent civilians against us, right? The challenge, or a challenge from the point of view of a combatant, is that you just don't know who's friend or foe. And so if the rules of engagement require you to allow those guys to walk by, and you can't really do anything about it, even if you suspect them of having been the ones that planted the mine, even if you suspect them of having been the ones who sniped at you the day before, the rules of engagement often will prohibit you from doing something, and you feel as if your hands are tied. It's no surprise then that Vietnam veterans who dealt with these similar kinds of rules of engagement will often, almost say that we wish that we had had the kind of free hand that the South Koreans had in war. So these rules of engagement can be very tough things. But one of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to stir up more resentment among civilians than our presence here already is stirring up. And also there are kind of these obligations of civilization, to use Robert E. Lee's words. And so we come back to this quote from Henry V. We give express charge that in our marches through the country there be nothing compelled from the villages. Treat the civilians as well as you can. Nothing taken but paid for. If you really need to take something, then give some kind of compensation. Don't upbraid the French. Don't abuse them with disdainful language. Let's try to keep the civilians in this world of war as contented as possible, understanding they're probably going to be discontented with our presence here. But let's try, to use a phrase from Vietnam, let's try to win their hearts and minds. And so this is what Henry V wants to do, and this is what the U.S. military has tried to do in some very, very difficult circumstances.